Hi every Hi everybody. So we are back again with presentation 2 on the HTTP protocol and AppArmor. You might ask. AppArmor is going to be considered a default security feature that is included within Ubuntu systems. The cool thing about AppArmor is AppArmor services are meant to lock down valuable processes that help to reduce the damage that vulnerabilities in the system can cause. One of the cool things that I've noticed is that in AppArmor, a lot of the processes are going to be restricted by the profiles that are contained in it. These profiles can be ran in two modes, so one will be complain mode and enforce mode. I'll actually discuss more about these profiles going into the next slide, but I thought that was pretty cool. Something else that's kind of interesting, AppArmor provides mandatory access control, or is a quote-unquote mandatory access control system. If you don't know what mandatory access control is, it refers to the type of system that the operating system constrains the ability of a subject or initiator to access or generally perform some sort of operation on an object or target. So ultimately, the mandatory access system helps to restrict processes as well in a more broad spectrum manner. AppArmor falls into that category. AppArmor also is an updated security feature with the new Ubuntu. It's been default in the system since the 7.10 application Ubuntu update. I told you guys I was going to mention some more about the profile. So this slide is pretty self-explanatory for the most part. Generating a profile within AppArmor allows the administrator to create a unique set of rules that the system has to follow. The system, what that means is you can set a set of parameters that the system can enable a user to follow, and that just means it's kind of like a strict set of guidelines that you have to go past or go through in order to do or access certain things. So like after my research, I've noticed there are profiles that people have created for restricting Firefox. So there are several examples out there that I thought were pretty cool. As I mentioned, there are two modes: complain mode and enforce mode, which is kind of ironic by the name. In complain mode, the system doesn't enforce any of the rules that are created by the profiles. What it does is it simply just keeps track of how many times the user is actually violating those rules, and then it reports it in a log. So you can actually view these logs later, and you can keep track of what violations are going on. However, on the other end, enforce mode basically enforces the profiles that have been set, essentially. It reports it, it enforces it, and lets you know the number of violations that have been attempted, as well as permit certain operations from occurring in the system, which is pretty interesting for the most part. I haven't really gotten a lot of time to really play with it. However, I do plan on adding more of these features to my system personally. And for security reasons, being able to restrict certain processes will allow your system to be less vulnerable in the future. And then here, I just included a photo of, or a screenshot of what a profile looks like in general. I just thought this was kind of cool and something to include. Okay, so next to the HTTP protocol. So if you don't know, it stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Essentially what it is when a web browser connects to a website, the HTTP protocol is used to communicate with the website browser that it's being hosted at and send and receive requests that the user is trying to use. And HTTP is going to be an application protocol. It also uses SSL and TLS certificates on the server to ensure that the communication between the browser and the server are going to be secure. During the transmission of the data, though, data tends to be not as secure or unguarded. The IP suite, the application layer contains the communication protocol and interface methods used in the process-to-process communication across an IP address computer network. So that's essentially what the HTTP process does. It allows you to set up a process-to-process communication method, which sums it down in little words. HTTP cannot regulate the content of the data that is being transferred. So ultimately means that there are no prior methods that exist to determine the sensitivity of any specific piece of data that's being transferred from the user workstation to the web server or vice versa. As far as I've researched, there is nothing available. However, I definitely imagine that in the near future we should be able to see some things like that coming about. So I know I mentioned the SSL/TLS certificate. So SSL is going to be a binding certificate. That means it binds together a domain name, a server name, or a host name in general, right? So SSL is really interesting. So that little thing in the top corner of your web browser, of your search browser where you see the secure, is essentially what your SSL is going to be. SSL, ironically enough, uses private keys and public keys, but primarily uses the public key, which, if you guys don't remember, it's a type of cryptography technique that is used. The public key, just to jog your memory, is going to be available to the public domain, and it's a primarily public key. So really anybody will have access to it. Couple things that the SSL and TLS does is that it keeps your data secure between the two servers, it builds and enhances your customer trust, and it improves conversion rate. A lot of those things don't necessarily matter to us. However, for the consumer side, for the person that's going to be or going to want to purchase, those certificates for their website, that's very important. So the TLS is going to be your transport layer security, and it's something that's usually implemented alongside the SSLs. And ironically enough, it's usually implemented or shown through XM and Apache. Those are the two examples that actually came up when I was doing my research, so I thought that was pretty interesting. So what is ISS? It is not something it's not only used for when you're on punishment in school. It also stands for Internet Information Systems. So ISS contains modules that are essentially individual features that a server uses to process the request. So some examples of those modules would include things like security modules, content modules, compression modules. Like all of those things would be embedded in the system. As far as I know, you should be able to look in the system and look up the kind of modules that come already embedded in the package. Some other security features, obviously it does offer enhanced security features, including a whole bunch of authentication mechanisms. It was too many to even name, but it does offer a bunch, which is really good. It also handles requests based on two main models, the single thread and the thread per thread request. So the thread per thread request essentially is, it's kind of similar as to what HTTP protocol does, but it could go both ways, essentially. Most times, though, that really means that the ISS will grab a thread from a thread pool of requests, essentially. Whereas, like, the HTTP protocol will really, it's like send and receive, question and answer. It's kind of what your HTTP protocol is. However, most web servers tend to handle request response pattern. That means the client receives a request and then receives a response. It's typically the pattern that most people go by, or most servers go by. So Apache for Ubuntu. So Apache is another open source free web server software. Apache can be referred to as Apache HTTP protocol. I also saw that when I was doing my research. Although we call Apache a web server, it's not a physical server, but rather a software that functions as a server. Apache's job is to establish connection between server and browser. It's a cross-platform software, which means that it can be used for the Unix and Windows systems. You might ask, well, how does the server communicate? For this PowerPoint, I also mentioned that HTTP protocol previously. The server and the client communicate through the HTTP protocol. So I thought those things were kind of interesting notes about the the Apache for Ubuntu. So some more features about Apache. I included the major two on here, but I am going to talk a little bit more about it. So it's very highly customizable, and it also features multiple security modules. So you might be asking, what does that mean? So Apache has a module-based structure, which we mentioned before. In simple terms, it allows the server administrator to turn certain functions on and off, right? So much like the ISS, Apache also has a bunch of security modules built into the system. A couple of examples of that would be like the run, which is new. I haven't really gotten to explore this much, but runtime loadable multiprocessing module. This module in particular is responsible for binding network ports and accepting requests from the client. That was the biggest feature that I noticed as far as like a security feature. I thought that was interesting, and it is included in the new update of Apache. And for Apache, a major security best practice would be to make sure that you keep your Apache as up-to-date as possible 24/7. After doing my research on the Apache, I noticed that that was one thing that I had seen across the board, and I decided to include it because I felt like when more than one person says it, clearly it is important to make sure and that it's done, and to help reduce the amount of vulnerabilities that you may have. Last slide, as we all know, is a citation slide. I included several links. There are a couple of more examples of profiles in here if you guys do happen to get a chance to look at these links. And that is it. Thank you.